Welcome to the Demystifying Technology podcast from the MacLaurin Group.
Typically, you go through the due diligence process. What the world of private equity?
Right. Can't wait. Demystify it. Welcome to another podcast, Demystifying Technology by the MacLaurin Group, and we have a special guest with us today, our first ever guest. It's Stefan Bauer.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you for coming along.
I don't know about being the first guest, but, it's okay.
Well, you're not going to be the standard to which we rate everybody else from.
Well, that's good. Everybody else has got an easier job.
Cool. So, we came up with a wonderful conversation to talk to you about.
Yes.
We're very familiar with AWS in this world, as is many other people, but Azure is becoming much of a foe and a serious competitor.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening. As you look at what's happening in Azure, there's a lot of pre-beta, those sorts of things, as Microsoft likes to sell, hey, I've got Postgres and it's perfect, but then you try and use it and it's, partially there, but it's really been interesting. It's been an interesting ride in comparing what's available out on AWS too.
So AWS, well, everybody's relatively familiar about it, and you too have got a lot of deep experience with AWS, including writing Redshift, the book, many years ago. Very proud to have a real life author on site.
Holy moly.
I know, we'll get his autograph soon. But anyway, so what would you say is the fundamental sort of misconception that most people have about the Microsoft Azure that you've spotted?
I think the biggest misconception that I've seen is that people feel like it is somehow fundamentally different. At the end of the day, from my perspective, it's a lot about, who are you paying to host your IP, right? I mean, whether you install SQL Server as a service on Microsoft or you run it on Azure or you've got, your file hosting or blob storage or what have you, it's a question of, what is your endpoint and who am I paying for that endpoint? At the end of the day, there's truly very little difference fundamentally when you look at the two services.
And is it fair to say that, you think Microsoft, you think Windows, but it's not necessarily Windows.
It's absolutely not Windows, and they have just as much when you look at the EC2 instances and those things that you're running, very similar infrastructure architecture. The wizard that you run through to implement things in the console is different, but short of that, I think under the covers you're running Linux boxes and it's doing the same things.
So when it comes to some of the sort of the richer services, like AWS has got the database as a service, where you don't think of them as individual EC2 instances anymore, etc. Well, what's Azure's version of that?
I think it's very similar. They're obviously much more on the Microsoft stack of things in terms of software as a service for, when you look at the plugins for what you get with SQL Server and those sorts of things. Running SQL Server as a extended instance is now available where you can literally cross between on-prem and Microsoft Cloud with an extended instance, and the database actually handles all that in the background. So obviously a little bit more on the SQL stack if you look at databases as a service than what you have otherwise. But you can run Postgres, you can run all of the what you would call normal databases as a service on Microsoft as well as you can on AWS. I think one of the advantages that you do get for most corporate environments is you've got your Active Directory integration that sort of comes very naturally with what happens in the Microsoft environment, and that makes some of the integration points a little bit easier with authentication and those sorts of things that sometimes with AWS you struggle with a little bit.
It's amazing the amount of we've bumped into a number of them where they're primarily in AWS, but they're still using the Active Directory from Azure, and largely because of the Office 365 is what's powering their
Right.
infrastructure, so it's much easier to have that single sign-on. But to the credit of AWS, the gap is bridged very easily there. They haven't put up too much resistance.
Right. Yeah, no, I think they've been smart in not trying to that, because that would be a hard stop for a lot of companies as to how to get across that.
So as you look at sort of the both landscapes, Is it a Pepsi versus Coke argument, or is there a compelling argument? Like, why are you and your current organization sort of throwing their hat into the Azure world as opposed to AWS?
We are at our core more of a Microsoft shop at the end of the day, from the database technology through what's being done on the websites and development tools and all of those sorts of things. So I think it was a fairly natural fit just from a organizational skill perspective to say, Microsoft and Azure, and it sort of all fits together fairly well. It's sort of like, buying into the Apple ecosystem. Once you've bought into an ecosystem, it's a lot easier just to live there than, saying, okay, well, I'm going to do this outside of there. So I think to some degree, I can't get too religious about, who I'm paying money to. But it's the sort of, which religion are you? Are you, of the Amazon or the Microsoft religion? But,
Well, and as we said at the start of the podcast, the Microsoft Cloud is now a wise decision to make. It's no longer sort of betting on the outlier.
Right.
No, it has arrived.
Yeah. No, it definitely has, and I think there's still a from usability and personal experience, there's still quite a number of rough edges, and there's a lot of things that are in preview, but the rate of change that Microsoft is deploying there is really impressive. They've really come a long way very quickly.
Well, let's not pretend AWS is polished. It has a tendency to release a new product, and until really the 6 months or the 18 months has run around, but does it become something that's production ready?
Sure.
There's a number of services we can all sort of point to and say, yeah, it's way better now, but I wouldn't have wanted to be an early adopter on that particular one, in that respect. So we were talking earlier today about Power BI.
Mm-hmm. It seems like that, to me, is when you look at the business intelligence landscape, Power BI has really come on strong. There's a lot of functionality in there out of the box. They're still somewhat in their infancy, but the ability to integrate that into your cloud instance. Have you had experience?
Yeah, and the Power BI is really a cool tool, and I think that's where Microsoft has learned a lot from I guess some of the other folks that are out there in the BI space and in software in general is kind of giving you a lot of functionality for free,
right.
And then sort of getting you hooked on the technology before you have to pay for anything, and that's sort of been my experience with the Power BI piece. And as you get into the cloud side of things, it's relatively inexpensive when you look at, by comparison to some of the big brother partners of Tableau or MicroStrategy or those kinds of guys that play in that space. And Power BI is it's another one of those tools, as Alan said. It starts off like, oh, do I really want to use this? But if it's 6-8 months in, it's actually a pretty darn good product.
And I've had the benefit of working with you for 47 years now,
something like that. It feels like it.
And we've gone through some very, very painful BI implementations, extremely painful. Some of the worst months of my life, in fact, and I think it becomes, one of the biggest challenges with a BI solution is selling that to the E-suite, and it becomes a non-issue at the point where, it's a fairly minimal add-on to what you're already doing.
And it's very fast to prototype things, and I think that's the selling point that you don't get in some of these other products. I mean, Tableau, maybe aside, you can get very quickly to something that's a usable product, but some of the other larger BI tools, Cognos, MicroStrategy, those sorts of tools, there's a fairly heavy investment of technology time to get that product to a place where you can say, okay, now we have a look and feel of a product that you can actually use. Power BI is very, very easy to just pull together some data, consume something, and produce some visualizations. It's shockingly easy.
Yes, I've played with it and pulled down the free version that you can deploy on your own desktop, build your own visualizations. You can't share it out like you can with the full version, but it seems to be a fairly fulsome offering, especially given the age of the product.
Yeah, and that's the impressive thing. And then, couple that with the ability to, as a service, run those things and connect to all the different data stores that you have available, whether it's Data Lake or otherwise on the Azure side of things. That's it's a compelling piece.
Well, we briefly talked about from a BI perspective, convincing the E-suite that's where you want to make an investment. How do you broach the topic of deploying all of this in the cloud in the first place especially with a financial services organization that tends to be somewhat, I would say, trepidatious and
Conservative.
very conservative and concerned about security. How do you go about selling, we're going to take this out of the terrestrial world and move it to the cloud?
I think at the end of the day, a lot of it, regardless of how conservative the company is, when you talk about eSuite, you're talking dollars and cents, right? So when you start to push it to a place where financially, you say, okay, I can run our on-prem hardware, and here's my data center costs, and here's what I need to spend on disk and electricity and rack space and everything else that goes with it. Or, hey, how about you take a look at these dollars? I think from a security perspective, it's clear it's possible to run these things securely. Whether you look at the government cloud, what is being done with government work in the cloud, or even large financial institutions and what they've committed to putting in the cloud. Now, that's not to say you can just throw things into the cloud and pretend like it's going to be okay. It does take a measure of caution, but I think there's enough proven track record there to be able to get people to say, okay, from a dollars and cents perspective, do you really want to run your hardware? And I think that's where you start to win those arguments. And some of the software as a service model, it's as frustrating as it is sometimes personally in your own life when you look at, I'm paying how many dollars for Netflix and how many dollars for, Spotify and how many dollars, it's this per month sort of lifestyle.
Creeps up on you.
It does, but I think in the corporate world it's starting to become the norm too, though, that we're paying per user per month sorts of costs. And I think that is becoming an acceptable way of sort of managing expenses, which is one of the things that I've always heard and had arguments with. I don't know how much the cloud is going to cost me because, it's all this variable sort of stuff. And if I buy a server, I know what it's going to cost me. But, I think people are starting to get their head around this sort of variable cost and the fact that there's a, per month charge that I'm going to have to pay, is sort of, it's a psychological thing more than anything else. And I think the security piece, in my view, really has been solved. So it's does need to be implemented correctly. But
yeah, I think there's a number of big players that have sort of thrown themselves wholeheartedly into the cloud that you would say, well, if they can do it, then there's really no more excuse for that. Your arguments are null and void at this point in the game. But I think you're right. If a well-architected and a well-secure database, you've got, in many respects, more vulnerabilities running in your own data center than you do.
Oh, I think you absolutely do. Everything from backup and recovery to disaster recovery and everything else that goes in between. And even security, I think you absolutely, doing it yourself is there's a certain amount of risk that you're taking on.
So as you look at the sort of, you touched upon that you were historically a Microsoft shop, so I assume then that your developers and the people that are actually producing code, etc., are well within the Microsoft Visual Studio suite and using the full Microsoft code deployment to get stuff up in and out to the cloud. Yeah,
for the most part, using some of the standard tools, GitHub for source management and Jira for deployments and those sorts of things. I mean, some of the open source things for where it makes sense. The Visual Studio is core to the process and how things are being built, and from an ETL perspective for warehouse loads and those sorts of things using core Microsoft technologies there as well. So it fits from a fit perspective. It's good, and from a being able to start the migration towards cloud, being able to extend databases to the cloud and those sorts of things sort of makes that stepping into the cloud a little bit easier rather than pull off the Band-Aid and say, hey, today I'm going to forklift things.
Sure. So as we come to the end here, let's get some of your wisdom over the years, as it were. So you've built many a warehouse, you've built many a data center in the old school, sort of touch a server and see a light flash and all that sort of stuff. As you would advise sort of like a CEO or a CFO that's listening to this, what would they choose between AWS versus Azure, or is that something that should be more down to what they're currently used to, given that the full SQL Server example?
Yeah, I think
is it not even a decision to make at this point?
I don't know that it is necessarily a driving decision in my mind. It's where are your core skills and competencies, and what is the technology stack that you're working in. If the core of what you're doing is truly all open source, then I would say it really doesn't matter. You can run open source just as well on Google as you can on Microsoft as you can on AWS. It really makes no difference. If your core really is core Microsoft, I would lean towards the Microsoft stack at this point, just because of ease of integration. Just like I said with the Apple ecosystem sort of thing, where it's like why try and fight upstream of something that's going to just plug together. But I don't know that it has to be a driving decision in any way whatsoever. The thing that I've experienced, though, that is not so much fun is trying to live between the two. So I would say pick a horse and go with it, rather than try to say, okay, well, these are the services I'm putting up on Microsoft, and these are the services I'm putting up on Amazon.
There's some cloud diehards that believe that a multi-cloud deployment is the way to go to make sure all your eggs are not in one basket. Yeah. But there are certain logistics that just
the logistics of that get to be rather difficult. That's
absolutely
so.
Well, thank you very much for coming along and speaking with us and sharing your wisdom. And
yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
Well, that was our first guest. I'm very excited at that.
Wow, he was smart. That's going to really raise the bar for the next one.
I know. So, but good on him. Thoroughly enjoyed Stefan popping along to see us, and we will be having many more guests on our podcast. So, where can they find out more information, Jim?
I would head over to MacLaurin.group, where you'll find additional podcasts as well as interesting articles.
Great. And please rate us on your favorite podcast directory, iTunes and Google Play. And we look forward to hearing from you again. So bye-bye.
Bye.